High noon struck on the bell tower. Instinctively, I rushed outside and checked the sun's position in the sky. At least 5 minutes late. Oh well, that'd give us another 5 minutes to pack before Elder Nicholas came ranting and raving at us to head out. How he planned to keep the town running without his best clocksmith was beyond me, especially since, old Gussie was in such a bad state already. Poor fool had better get ready for taking his meetings in the middle of the night. I imagined the terror of this place without time. Work shifts would go off schedule, the steel we were meant to ship down land would be put on the rafts a day late, and they'd charge us bigger tariffs. The people wouldn't be able to afford their favorite toffees, the kids would go to school whenever, and maybe it would just be the same. That thought chilled me more than anything. But as long as civilization whirred on towards the poles, we were good. I meant something to the town. Old Gussie meant something big, and I was going to fix him. Eventually. No way I was being sent out. There was still a bunch of indolence available for that. But the lotteries didn't run off of merit or anything like that. I'd picked one of the short sticks, and thus it was my fate to go out there. I could huff and puff about it all I wanted, but I knew that I was going to find my way to the new settlement whether I wanted to or not. I didn't have it in me to run away to the western fringes, to risk being branded a pariah for the rest of my life. That sort of hell was nearly guaranteed. But the old colony? I didn't know. That was the point. I didn't know, and I was used to knowing, to getting everything right on point, even the future. But I'd pulled the short stick, and so uncertainty was my new king. My things were almost packed. I had simply left a shirt or two lying around as an excuse to hold on to my connection to this place. The house was unimportant. I'd been born in the place, married, divorced, but it had never been where I'd spent most of my meaningful time. But the town, my friends, what was left of my family... I had a sour mind, but even it could not deny the pleasures I'd had simply from living here. And the new place, my heart pounded against my chest. I wasn't superstitious. I wasn't. And yet, my heart was. I had my gun. I had my tools, muscles, knowledge, and the support of 300 others. It couldn't be all bad, right? We clogged into the town square as one large mass of bereaved but obedient souls. Our relatives waved to us from the balconies of the merchant houses, and one of the more lucent elders gave a speech about how this duty of ours had been held by the peoples of this region ever since the first wars. I couldn't hear anything else that he said. I could only concentrate on the frantic yet pitiful pumping of my heart, keeping it going through nothing more than sheer willpower. A tradition we'd had since the first wars. Yes, that was the treaty. The one spot the leagues couldn't colonize. They'd been at each other's throats in a territorial war for centuries until they found this one place. The place of death. Idiots would call it the place of endeavor, but we knew. I knew it. Everyone knew it. It didn't matter that the threat of the place was unseen or ancient or anything. Simply because I didn't understand the horrors of the last grove didn't mean it was irrational for me to fear them. And yet, I couldn't give in to that fear. Not because I appreciated tradition or anything. I didn't even really appreciate the treaties. No, there was still a chance that the other colonists had simply gone somewhere else, maybe even underground. Yes, that made sense, underground, that there they could live out their lives while still leaving the void of that place open to the leagues to throw their idiot treaty traditions into. The speech was over. We were walking east. The bundle of people was so tight that even if I had willed myself to escape at this point, it wasn't happening. Not until we were out of town. We reached the burrows. I could turn around, walk in another direction. They might have tattooed my palm, but I could find a job with gloves. I could have a renegade lifestyle if I wanted it. Why then did I fear that more than I dreaded this unknown? We were outside of town. There was now a good couple of meters between myself and the closest person. I could bolt at any second and probably never be tackled. Could anyone care? Did we have such sympathies for the welfare of the nations that we would sacrifice the certainty of our futures to ancient statements of peace? Apparently, I would. We were at the first line of stones, the usual demarcation between clans' lands. But there was no clan beyond, no town, no city, no league. Simply the dead lands. But even then I knew the name I'd given the place wasn't appropriate. I'd never personally toured the eastern edges, nor had anyone else, really. The Grove was only some place we went when the calendar the elders maintained demanded it. Even though the mysterious blight which afflicted the clan's lands had been proven time and again to not afflict the fields to the east, no one but the barley-farming outcasts spent any good deal of time out here, and everyone knew the elders wouldn't trust them with a project as important to the leagues as this. Only those of us with enough loyalty to the others to sequester ourselves in the cities were allowed. And in all honesty, in retrospect, that was a bad thing. We were stupid to allow ourselves the cloak of loyalty, just so our names could be tossed in a hat. Just a bit further east, beyond the line, we were allowed to establish a settlement anywhere in the meadows. It didn't matter. I wasn't going to be making anything other than clocks, and, if I felt like it, my own meals. To say the place was idyllic would be an understatement. The Grove was the very embodiment of heaven itself. The sun fell at just the right angle to warm your back, but not to sear your shoulders off. The waterfalls kicked up just enough mist to ensure the ground would be wet and fertile for centuries to come. And so many birds and butterflies flew through the air that it would be to no man's shame to drop their work and simply appreciate the scenery. Of course, there were the bare-bones skeletons of the dwellings past expeditions had just left to sour the mood. But the general impression remained that we'd stumbled straight into heaven. With the scent of indescribably succulent fruit hanging in the air, we immediately set out to work making our new home, clearing the debris of old to make way for the new. Of course, even as we descended into this cheerful pursuit, a note of misapprehension resonated through our minds, and it was decided that we would send a few scouts out to map our reclaimed territory to see if we could find whatever it was that had drove the other colonists away. Of course, to thoroughly map so large a territory in the time required to put everyone's mind at ease, we needed a lot of feet and eyes. And besides a couple of brash teenagers, there weren't any volunteers. So we settled once again on drawing lots, with the job going to those with the 20 labeled sticks. Just as my luck would have it, as I was about to wipe the expectant sweat off my forehead and go back to build my new home, I drew the 20 of sticks. I figured then it was just another example of my family's infamously atrocious. Now, well, I'm not so sure. I took it upon myself to explore the direct eastern borders of our new domain, figuring in such a way I wouldn't be isolated enough for anyone to hear the screams that if something went wrong, if there was some monster who roamed the hills or anything. It took me a few hours to reach the boundary stones, and I passed nothing but more ideal countryside on the way. Berry bushes, bubbling springs, and acres upon acres of green fields untrodden by anyone save the native animals. The boundary stones themselves shone with a polished vigor that even the most well-maintained of the ones back home simply could not match. It was as though someone from the neighboring tribes had made it their duty to sneak into these usually forbidden lands to fortify them against all damages of weather or beast. I was immediately suspicious, of course, and decided to scope out the surrounding area for tracks. Unfortunately, I snooped for evidence of activity so thoroughly I didn't take the time to note where my feet were going. So it was only natural that I stepped straight into the gaping hole in the ground that someone had covered over with a grass tarp. The tumble was only a few feet down at rock face, so I wasn't bruised too much. The hole I had fell into seemed to stretch far beyond the reach of the sunlight, so I was immediately intrigued, and let's be honest, scared. Someone had meant for me to fall into this cavern, but who and why? My mind screamed that I should ascend back up the hole that I'd fallen into, but I was getting my job done, damn it. So I lit the kerosene lamp I brought in my pack and descended into the unknowable darkness. After all, if whatever had ruined the past expeditions lurked down these cool stone halls, and I lived to tell the tale, perhaps our own would be saved and I'd be branded a hero. Maybe I'd even get a stipend from the Elder's treasury and be allowed to return home, my fame shielding my name from the disdain of the ancestors and their gods. And then I'd have all the time I wanted to fix old Gussie, or even better, make it a second Gussie. Yes, that's what I would do. Or better yet, that one stray thought I'd had at the plaza was correct. Underground. Truth. Yes, I would live. My feet clattered down unremarkable hall after unremarkable hall as I mapped out the cave network. I found nothing of interest save for several beautiful fluorescent rock formations and several deep ponds of the clearest water I'd ever seen. Small blind fish swam about, and their sleek flesh glistening under the gaslight. If I hadn't had my trusty pouch of jerky handy, I might have tried some fishing. But I noted the presence anyway, just in case there was a drought or something we needed more food. After a while, my legs grew tired, and I had to force back yawns. I checked my watch, the only one that's accurate for miles around. 9:15 p.m. A bit earlier than I usually hit the sack, and the cave floor wasn't exactly a good bed, but the sun had already set, and navigating the caves was just as hard as walking into the dark sky. Even in the dark, it took me a while to slip into the warm arms of sleep as the floor hurt my back, and my mind was invaded by images of a sharp-toothed beast eating my flesh, or my idiotic sleepwalking self just strolling right off the cavern's path and into one of the many bottomless pits which yearned for my broken and twisted body. It took a while for my sleepiness to brush these fears aside, but the greater darkness of slumber inevitably subsumed me. Then I woke up. My limbs were lethargic and sore, and my eyelids yearned to fall once again even as I opened them. I reluctantly checked my watch, my own temporal guide for these sunless caverns. 3:22 a.m. Something woke me up, and it wasn't my sore back. I popped some more oil into my lamp and craned my ear to the darkness. Nothing, just a bunch of calcified stalactites letting droplets of water pitter-patter into the ground. Drip, drip, thud. There. I knew the sound wasn't hallucination this time. I pulled my flintlock out of its holster, my heart pounding, mind doubting there was anything I could possibly do to avert my now certain death. "Is anyone there?" I stammered out, my voice barely louder than the cavern drip. No response. Then I saw it, just out of the corner of my eye, barely illuminated by the light of my lamp. A pale, distorted face. I instinctively jumped, and my flintlock fell from my hand and clattered against the stone ground. I yelled out a swear and scrambled to pick it up, cursing my nervous fingers. But I wasn't fast enough. In a second's time, the face and the hideously deformed body it was attached to crossed the whole extent of the cavern and tackled me to the ground. Mad, hungry eyes stared at me, a single long drop of saliva forming in the curl of what I presumed was a man's mouth. I tried to force the beast off with tooth and nail, kicking and screaming till the fire in my muscles burnt out. But the white mutant's hands held firm, possessed with a strength that only those who have known a lifetime of adversity can achieve. It wasn't long before I was being dragged by the hem of my coat to horrors unknown, my mind contented with the prospect that this is where it all ended. Here, in a cave, made food to a pale demon. I wept a solitary tear for Lisa, whom I'd never see, another for old Gussie, who would never truly be fixed. Then I let a dozen tears fall for myself, their sound mingling in a horrid chorus with that eternal, constant drip, while the monster dragged my bruised backside down abyssal hall after abyssal hall. I managed to collect myself enough to notice that I was mumbling something under its breath, something that I could understand. Come, not far enough here. Bad glow comes soon, bad unmaking. At first I thought the was man, the title I from here on out will be given to one of my captors' ilk. So at first I thought the was man was just being the insane beast I thought he was. Then in the distance I saw it. A pale glow, a semblance of being in a realm of pure darkness. Even as I was dragged away from it, the light grew closer and closer, puddling and pooling over the stalagmites and the cave floor. With it came my hopes of rescue. Maybe some of the other scouts had found the cave. Maybe they could save me. With the little bit of power I had regained while being scraped against the cave ground, I squirmed with all my might. Since I'd waited a good while, I had the advantage of surprise on my side this time. I managed to wriggle out of my coat with the was man not noticing for a good 2 seconds. It was just enough time for me to jump to my legs and sprint towards the eking force of my would-be salvation. But 1 second and a few yards later, I stopped. There was no one in that light. It simply was. And the tone was off. It was too bright. Even from several hundred yards away, my retinas ached just looking at the stalagmites which were flamed by its celestial splendor. Even with its unknown, unnatural, severe qualities, a part of my mind yearned for it. Even though it wasn't my comrades, it offered the solution to something. Whatever that solution was, if I just let it wash over me. "No, stupid!" roared the was man, his vocal cords simultaneously ranging in notes between the purr of a kitten and the roar of a lion. Once again I felt those Goliath-strength arms tackle me to the ground, felt my skin and bones shriek as they crashed into the hard stone floor. "Almost home," ranted the was man as he dragged me once more by the scruff of my neck. The light was fast approaching, every surface it hit being stung by some sort of unknowable truth. My instinct told me to suppress that part of my mind which was singing in rapture. I thank the ancestors for that instinct now. I did not struggle, did not move an inch against the was man's grip as he slid us through the port entry to his home. Just a second before the viscous light bubbled against its surface. Through the tiny gaps of stone, a trickle of the substance fell through, brushing against the leather of my boot and quite possibly working its way through to my foot. It stung, but it was not painful. I don't quite know how to describe it other than the sensation was something that shouldn't have been, much as the was man's entire life was. In 1 second I danced with abominations cruel and kind. Somewhere else. But I wasn't there. I was here, in the caves, kidnapped by a troglodyte-like was man. In that cavern lurked dozens of deformed misfortunates much like him, all skewed in some form or fashion. As soon as I returned to my senses from that delicious glimpse of light, they flocked to me like we as kids used to flock to the bakery on Thursday. To them I was the free cake. 100 pale hands rubbed and marveled at the intactness of my clothes in the dim light of makeshift torches and odd glowing plants. They pawed at my undeformed face, but they stayed away from my shoe. When one of the smaller wasmen crept towards it, she sniffed the air with the thoughtful style of a dog, hissed, then spit on it. The rest joined in, and I could do nothing but beg them in every tongue I knew for the insanity to end. And it didn't. It didn't for a long, long time. Sandpaper-like tongues crept down every inch of my jacket as well. I'll be honest, as I screamed. There's not much else to do when ambushed by a horde of deranged mutants hundreds of feet below ground. And then I passed out. Not the wasman's fault, I must admit, but simply a feature of my weak heart. Light. Not a lot of it. Frankly, I didn't have the faintest idea of why the first thought that passed through my head was that there was light, because there wasn't really. Just the faint glow of a dimly radiant rock formation hundreds of yards in the distance. I was in a dwelling, or something that could pass as a dwelling for a drunk. It wasn't more than a few rock slabs bound together with rope and weeds, just large enough for one person to lay on the ground in mild comfort and stare at the faint radiance of the odd, striped rocks which rimmed the cave wall. Except I wasn't lying on the ground in mild comfort, for there was another person in there with me, up and awake. The same wasman who had shepherded me through the caverns to this place. He had a grim look on his face, so as though he only watched over me out of obligation, not goodwill. When he saw that my eyes had flickered open, he grunted something in his strange underground tongue, and placed a mess of slime and bucket by my face. Okay, I'm being uncharitable again. It wasn't a mess of slime, it was a fish, pale to the point that it was nearly translucent. It was utterly disgusting and stank of algae, but the wasman just kept staring at me and gesturing at the unappetizing thing until I sank my teeth down into its malleable flesh. It was not nearly as bad as I expected. Although, considering I figured it would kill me, the fish didn't have too high of a bar to cross. Its best feature was that my tongue couldn't make out its slimy exterior for its skin. And the thing was so jam-packed with salts that I wouldn't have been able to notice a putrid flavor if it was sitting right there in my mouth. I hadn't even felt the hunger in my belly until the fish sank into it. I tried to ask my regretful wasman caretaker how long I'd been out, but our language similarities seemed to begin and end at bad glow. I reckon I must have been out cold for at least a few hours, but it's impossible to tell underground. As soon as I finished my dinner, the wasman grabbed me round the arm. His grip wasn't as strong as when he dragged me through the caves, but still I could feel the feral intensity in his muscles. One wrong move and the beast might have ripped me from limb to limb. He guided me to the exterior portion of the cave, round a couple of ponds which glowed with the exact same ribboned light of the rocks in my lodgings. Salt. The entire wall was salt. Many of our relatively industrialized society will forget how much of a staple salt is to any living creature's diet. He began scraping away at the salt outcropping with a stone chisel which was lying around, and gestured for me to do the same. Considering how he had as much physical power in one of his arms as I had in my entire body, I felt it might be idiotic to not comply. So I went to work, jotting down in my memory that I would inform my fellow colonists about such a spot deep below, should we ever evade the northern salt tariffs. The wasman scampered off to the opposite edge of our cavern to weave some stringy algae-like plant together. Disgusting, but a sign of civilized thinking. Work. Dark, dirty work. This struck me as particularly terrible. I didn't expect that I had been rendered a slave, no, and in fact they kept me under no supervision, seemingly assuming that there was no end to the sun. Sorry, bad figure of speech. It seemed like they thought there was no chance I could flub such a simple task. And I didn't. I'm no stranger to work, even if my hands are more suited to delicate mechanical tasks. Every few hours, one of the Wesmen would bring me a fish. I slathered in my newly harvested salt. I ate it. They took the rest of my salt. It was a simple place, disagreeable in many ways, but most of all in its lack of light. As for sleep, I think the Wesmen rested simply when they felt like it, which was often. I was not underground long enough for my mind to change cycles or anything, so I slept with the sun even though I didn't feel its graceful touch. I spent 2 days scraping away at the salt outcropping and observing our strange neighbors. Despite their malformed appearance, they did not appear to have a single hostile bone in their bodies. They ripped at the bizarre cave fish with horrific ferocity, but they never turned their teeth to me, even though I was the intruder in their lands, not the other way around. In the hours where the others didn't work, I skulked out an outline of the caves. They were large, enough to sustain thousands of inhabitants, even though I could only judge the Wesmen's population to be in the high 300s. How the fools had failed to run into overpopulation, I never hazarded to guess. Perhaps they died to whatever that enigmatic thing that flooded the upper caverns was. Maybe they died of terminal illness. Whatever the case, there was little threat that they would ever spill out into the surface to overwhelm the colonies. Strong enough to roll the passage bulges though they were, there was nothing to their anatomy that would keep a good shot to the chest from stopping their breathing. But I shouldn't talk about my saviors in such a fashion. It's just tempting punishment from the gods, but still they were so ugly that... Again, tempting punishment. After I had chipped enough salt from the caverns to set up the Wesmen for a good month or two, I settled my mind on escaping. I'd learned what I'd wanted to learn, and I was craving the light. The true light of the sun, mind you, not whatever got me in the upper caverns, but I kept working for a while. Past the first few days, the other Wesmen would come to seek me out to study my behaviors, not the other way around. At least I assumed they were studying me with their pale, unblinking eyes and blank expressions. Though my skin is not so tanned for a surface dweller on account of a professional clockmaker, it still shone with a vigor that these cave-trapped fools could never match in the rock formations or creatures of their underground prison. Plus, my hair was, and is, lively. I worked with greater industriousness than them, even given the low importance of my task. I did not slouch nearly so much, and... Right, there I go again. Look, I'm trying to shake the rancid ideas that are stuck in my head, but if you had seen them... They were a curious lot. Unlike the first night, or day maybe, they were none too keen to get close to me. Normally they'd stay a good 2 or 3 meters off, at the very least, and just let their odd, colorless eyes drift about my frame. Sometimes they'd grunt in commentary, other times they'd remain as silent as the stars at night. What struck me most in that odd in-between time of contemplation and observation was simply how varied their forms were, almost as though they took from completely different tribes of people. And yet they were stuck here, in that cavern, seemingly forever. Then one came close to me, another one with the best posture I had found in any of their degenerate race. Her eyes were sunk deep in her skull, wisps of silvery hair lining her lopsided face. Even though under the dark light it was still difficult to look at her, she was much more comely and, may I mention, less deranged looking than her kin. I am leader. she said in a voice alternatively deep and high-pitched, lightly echoing against the cavern's walls. Always been here, but heard of people from above like you. Grandparents say that they came from above, too. And all ones before came from Bad Light Place. Is it true? Bad Light Place? You mean the surface? I don't know. Bad light sometimes rolls down cave. Very little of it seeps into home. I don't know what you're talking about. Where I'm originally from, this light, if it's actually a light, it didn't exist. We didn't have it chasing us through our homes, nor we had good light from the sky, so that you could see things, you could plant things in the soil and smell the fresh air. Is it like here, with good light? Yes, it's like here, but just a little better. I appreciate you all helping me out, but keeping me from starvation and dying from thirst and such. But I need to get back to... No, you can't go. The bad glow will take you, change you. You will not be the same. I don't care if I remain the same or whatever. I just want to go back home. My kin must be worried about me. No, can't let you go. Would make me feel bad. I terminated the conversation, unwilling to indulge her curiosity if she wished to hold me prisoner. I huffed my way back to my quarters, wondering whether I had the mechanical genius to fashion some lever out of stone so that I could move the obstacles with nothing but my bare muscles. It seemed unlikely, but what choice did I have? What was I going to do, stay underground like some sort of bug? What was for me here? Crippled old women with the voices of children, blind and deaf men whose legs had been shredded by years of walking unprotected in the caverns. They were all, let's face it, crazy. Mumbling to himself was just as, if not more common than holding a conversation with a neighbor. They all bustled along with the tasks of maintaining their mock society at random hours of the day. After all, night wasn't exactly a thing down there. Even though I respected their relative industriousness of hospitality, apparent concern for my safety, I understood that I could not stay there with them. Every time I saw one of their hunchback forms slink around in the half-darkness, my stomach squirmed. I tried my best to calm it, to force my revulsion down with a good handful of old adaptability, but no. After a couple of days passed of scraping yet another batch of salt off the walls of the cavern, I snapped. I pounded my fists against the cavern walls until the skin broke and blood poured forth. And then I continued pounding. I kicked with my bare feet and screamed obscenities to the surface, hoping they'd eventually reach the gods' ears in the heavens. I needed light. I needed it. I needed a good blanket made out of a plant that didn't scrape my skin raw. A nice fire where I didn't have to worry about the smoke filling up my room and clogging my lungs. I needed a good book, someone with a vocabulary advanced enough to speak to. But most of all, I needed the light. I needed its warm caress touching every inch of my body to remind me that things were okay, that I wasn't helpless. I have no idea how long I screamed until I once again passed out. I really do need to get myself checked out. My apparent heart troubles are still undiagnosed, but anyway, I found myself back in my rucksack that was still scratchier than burlap, algae bandages woven about my hands. The Wesmen were good people. I really didn't deserve them. They welcomed me into their home, kept me fed, and even bandaged me up when my mind failed me. And all I could think about when I saw them was how much I craved to see the faces of my sun-drenched kin. I needed the sun. The sun, the sun, the sun, the sun! I had no idea I was so addicted to it when I walked the surface. No idea I needed its vibrant pulse to stay sane. It got dark in the winters, sure, but it never this dark. It was never so bleak that I dreaded opening my eyes for fear that the reality of the waking world was just as dreary as the moments of dark isolation before my dreams. The articulate was-man was the one who tended to me. I worried that she might have formed some attachment to me that was untoward. No, don't get me wrong, I was appreciative of her efforts to keep my fragile frame alive, but it is difficult to be physically appreciative of someone with such features. By the ancestors, I hate that he even said that. I apologize. Anyways, she tended to me as my body healed back to normal-ish condition. The others demand that I attend to my soul-scraping duties during this time. As she replaced my bindings, I would tell her all about the histories of the above world, the wars, the technologies, the ideologies, and such. I'm sure she understood, at least a little. Her kind had their own primitive form of ancestor reverence that they maintained over the generations. From what she told me, it sounded like a highly perverted form of that practiced by the Fifth Conclave, an already heretical sort. But I could not even hold that against the was-man. I was their ward, her ward. I was alive solely because they had taken pity on my sun-soaked skin. But I needed the light. I desperately craved it. Time did nothing to ease my addiction. In fact, it seemed to grow worse. I knew that spring was drawing to a close on the surface, and I just couldn't do with missing my favorite season, false light be damned. So, as soon as my wounds had fully healed, I called all the Wesmen together. Despite my mental will, I wasn't strong enough to move any of the exit boulders on my own. I needed their brutish strength for that. As usual, the leader was the only one to speak. "You are not going?" I am going." "Why, there is bad light. It will bring nothing." I rolled my eyes. This, let it be noted, makes no impression on anyone in the dark. Sure, that weird light might kill me, but I am not going to be spending the rest of my life rotting deep under the ground, drinking drip water and eating uncooked cavefish. Honestly, I can't think of a worse way to spend my time, not really. If I leave, maybe I can tell my people about the bad glow, and perhaps they can figure out how to make it go away. She shook her head. "It will not happen. When it comes to me leaving, yes, it will. I can't guarantee anything else." There was a chorus of whimpering, half-said arguments, and maybe a bit of weeping, but I stood steadfast in my decision to brave that buttery nonsense that plagued the upper caverns. My obstinacity wore my Wesman caretakers out, and they shrugged what counts for shoulders among their lot, and handed me one of their fish-scale cloaks their scouts of the breed used to explore the outer caverns. Apparently they protected to some degree from the burning influence of the light. I accepted the gift with a hefty dose of skepticism, still not quite convinced by the fear of that glow. Too much time in the caverns had obviously obscured them from the truth of the day. Light was just slightly different here, that's all. More an oozing liquid than some facet of the air, but that was fine. Even as I left for the upper caverns, bedecked in my incredibly smelly fish suit, to please any Wesmen who might have been following me, I still held their hatred for the light in disregard. I wandered the caves aimlessly for a few hours, until I could see that same golden bloom working its way through the caverns. I would go where it came from. Then the searing force of the light crushed against me. My eyes felt as though they had been tossed into a blacksmith's furnace. My skin that wasn't obscured by the fish scales ached and groaned, grinding as though it were growing and shrinking. Images danced in my head of things I couldn't recognize. Metal carts that moved on their own, a group of people wearing deer antlers shuffling an odd dance about a fire, and a beast with 1,000 maws reaching out to consume the last of its pet dog's fleas. It must have lasted only a second as the wave of light crashed past me, leaving only an echo of itself to guide the way. But still, it felt like an eternity. I did my best to snap out of my trance. I understood now. No wonder they feared this light. There was too much to it, too much truth, and it was the worst sort of truth. Truth without context, truth without laws. The skin on my uncovered face continued to hum with the light's heavenly tune, and I could feel its searing fingers inch their way deeper into my skin. It was nothing for us, nothing I could stand. My pace quickened until I was finally able to see a crest of normal starlight peek its way through the cave ceiling. The sky was once again obscured by another infernal flash. This time my eyelids were able to respond appropriately, falling just quickly enough to shield my sight from the most vigorous part of the blast. Like last time, the sickly light retreated like some mischievous ooze or melting butter, leaving flecks of itself on every surface of the cave annex. Spots of it still peppered my skin, and the bizarre feeling of rapture mixed with dread pulsed in my exposed flesh with even more intensity than before. I looked down at my clothes to find their colors glue in the midday sun with more vibrancy than I could ever remember them doing so before. A thought warmed its way into my mind about the true nature of this unmaking glow, but I forced it down to the pits of thought for fear of being wrong in dedicating too much of my brain power to it. That was reserved for the legs. I climbed out best I could, but felt the fish scale cloak restricting my upward movement, more so than they had before. It was almost as though their interlocked scales were fusing together, welding themselves into some sort of plate mail. My muscles didn't fail me this time, thank the ancestors, and I found myself at the bottom of a well. Thing is, I recognized this well. This was the well we'd immediately filled in when we set up camp around the ruins. Same brickwork, same little patch of sand and larva eggs over by the gaping hole in the side. I shimmied up the well's edges, this being an easy task as time had worn many foot and handholds into the brick. As my eyes edged over the broken surface, I was so astonished by the sight they found that I lost my grip and collapsed back into the thing. My companions hadn't decided to reopen the well. No. My comrades were gone, and so was the whole village. Everything being replaced with the mess we had seen when we first entered the grove. I paced around the nightmarescape, trying to best understand what had gone on here. Unmaking. That's what the Wesman had called it. Perhaps... No, it couldn't be, but was it really possible? A tiny sound brought me out of my melancholic contemplation, that sound being a small boy's tears. I pursued the noise with all the might of my feeble little legs, until I came upon one of the larger corpses of houses that infested the area. Inside, huddled in a ball, was a little kid, probably about the age of 6. His clothes were tattered, skin covered in dust, and his eyes were full to the brim with tears and fear. I beckoned to the kid to come with me, but the poor soul seemed to have forgotten how to walk. I then asked him his name, something I felt would make him more comfortable of going along with a stranger who claimed to be saving his life. The boy shook his head and wrote with his bare finger the letters WILBUR in the surrounding dust. Wilbur. Can't speak too, Wilbur? Doesn't matter, climb on my back. We're going to get out of whatever the hell this place is. Elders will be damned. I'm 80% sure that's what I said. Sounded like a nice quote. I took my fish scale cloak off and laid it over the boy's back. The kid accepted the slimy shielding with a whimper and did his best to raise himself up to my offered shoulder. Luckily, Kid hadn't forgotten the use of his arms at least, so he held my neck and shoulders in a grip stronger than I'd have ever experienced for a piggyback ride. With that, I took off, unwilling to spend another single second in that haunted place, and most of all unwilling to brace my new exposed skin against another wave of that dastardly light. But it came. Wave after wave of the infernal stuff. I saw my own grave faces I did not know weeping over it. A far-off woman dreamed an idea which emancipated the children of the flesh. My flesh boiled and was made anew. The fabric of my shirt was alternatively rotted and dewoven into a ball of yarn. Wilbur hung onto my back with a vice-like grip which forced the air from my lungs. Trees were cut down and born in front of my eyes, but we lived. We had made it a few miles from the colony when my legs finally gave out under me. I pushed them too hard. No amount of willpower or fear was going to bandage up the torn muscle and frayed ligaments. I begged Wilbur to get down, run with his own little legs, leave me there in the clearing to die. He just gave me that damn stare of his and pointed to where we'd come from. I used my not nearly as sore arms to twist myself around on the grassy knoll. Sure enough, just behind was that same buttery bloom of light, eking its way towards us like a wave caught by the gravity on the lakeshore does just before it's sucked back into itself. It oozed its way in our direction, inch by inch, moment by moment, the grass and trees wilting, crackling, and blackening under its influence. My heart beat faster, and I threw all my pitiable energy I could at squirming away with my arms. Rocks pierced my skin. Wilbur's weight continually pressed against the brittle bones of my back, and I could feel that same terrible licking the air just past the soles of my feet as I crawled like no living being has ever crawled before. But then it stopped. The onrushing staleness in the air faded, and I was once again bombarded by the sense of life properly lived and time not so terribly unwoven. I kept crawling, though, just to be sure. My arms were covered in blood, although whether it was my own or a melange of crushed insects, I was not sure. Probably mine, but my entire body throbbed with so much pain from so many causes I couldn't be sure. I crawled on my belly for what seemed like 3 eternities, until even my arms gave out too. With what little energy I still had, I satisfied my morbid curiosity. I craned my neck to see that same glossy light just a dozen or so feet behind me, but it didn't seem to be moving any further. Instead, the terrible substance seemed to hit a barrier beyond which even it could not pass. Brightness bubbled against the invisible wall with a sort of sizzling sound. My energy expended, my head crashed into the silky dirt and dewy grass. I woke up delirious. Even though my lips stung from lack of water and every inch of my muscles screamed for rest, I felt relief, as though some massive burden had been lifted from my shoulders. Sure enough, it had. Not in the way I wanted it, though. Not in the way any of the ancestors would have wanted either. Wilbur was gone. In a protective panic, I managed to rustle a bit more strength into my bleeding legs, just to look for the poor boy. It didn't take long until I checked the spot where the delirious light had reached the bounds set for it by that arcane force which made it. Beneath a pile of asphyxiated cavefish were the charred bones of what had been a boy, cradled in the arms of cinder-strewn dead grass. I swore at myself to high heaven for falling asleep, of letting him walk free, but with his death came understanding. I knew what the light did, at the very least. It warped time. Under its influence, things that were or weren't, and vice versa. I returned to the largest spectacle since the very sun went dark when I was a child. Covered in blood, dirt, soot, my clothing alternatively rotting and gleaming, and the bones of a child cradled in my arms. Not exactly something you see every day, or indeed ever at all. At first the others thought I was an apparition, some ghost of the ancestors come to chastise them for disturbing the resting place once more. Then they realized it was me, good old watchmaker they'd sent to die in those long, if that's even the right word, long-forgotten ruins. When the council members caught wind of my plight, they shuttled me away for a bath and a nice, comfortable bed to reveal everything of the tragedy the following morning. They wouldn't let me debrief the town on my own, no. That would disturb too many people, make everyone too scared to do their daily chores. Bah. If they don't cancel an extra expedition, I'll do something. I don't know what. Scream, tear my hair out, summon the ghosts of the ancestors myself, or carve a new tunnel for the Wesman straight into the Elder's chambers to kill him. I don't know. I don't care. But no one is going back there. No one. As I'd largely been an afterthought addition to our Elder's expedition, I'd never gotten to learn most of the other colonists' names. I figured it didn't matter anyway, since they'd all been killed, disintegrated, or whatever terrible thing that rancid light did to people after a while. So just a couple of days ago, I snuck into the archives while the cleric slept, making sure my feet pattered ever so lightly on the ground to make sure I didn't disturb her. Sure enough, between records of 1,500-year-old farming techniques and 20-year-old speech transcriptions was a solitary binder marked Reclamation Endeavor 154, Manifesto, Year of the First, 3076. 3076. This year. I quietly flipped through the pages, making sure my gaze didn't stray too long on the ones whom I recognized, for fear of considering their fate, their bright, smiling faces twisted and tortured by that poisonous light. There he was. Wilbur Magnon, also known by the alias Burr. Age, 96. Profession, senior member, Circle of Elders. That was it. That was all I needed to know. Poor Wilbur had been the only one who'd lived long enough to withstand the light's influence for too long. The only person who had enough years on him to live as the past slipped into the present. No wonder he couldn't walk or talk when I saved him. Poor Sob had been so senile that he needed others to take care of him. Speaking of which, how old am I now anyway? I was lucky enough to not have the light wash over me as I slept, but I did brave it on my skin long enough to keep Wilbur alive. I do feel like I've got a bit of extra pep in my step now that my wounds have healed. But that's unimportant. What is important is that the elders come to hear this tale over and over again, one way or another, and that they finally come to believe it. Considering that they lied about this being the 40th expedition and not the 154th, I'm not so optimistic that their grey old heads haven't heard begging and pleading on the topic before. Maybe each time that someone comes back they silence them. I admit I would not be too grieved by that possibility. I cannot unsee that light, except in death. So maybe they kill me to stop some large-scale war. Even if that's the case, it doesn't matter. I'll fight for the stop to this barbarism, no matter how stubborn they are, no matter how many times I have to remember that sting, that terrible light, the warping of things into what they could but never should be. In no way is it our sacred duty to recolonize the lands of our ancestors, to renew the glory of ages past, to prevent wars, or whatever it is we tell ourselves now. Some terrible force already lurks there doing that whole glory reclamation thing for us. Best to not upset it with our presence, whatever it may be. To be honest, I'm not really curious about the malignant light, or the forces behind it. I'm just glad I get to spend a little bit more time fixing up old Gussie. Time will work here, at least. That I swear.